Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. So thanks for that introduction, Michael. As Michael mentioned, we've been engaged in this study for quite some time now. And the purpose of this study was to investigate the potential of introducing a local transit service within Grimsby. So when we first started out this study, we undertook this in two phases. And the first phase was to identify current or future transportation needs of the community and the role of local public transit, and also assess the feasibility of operating a local transit service in Grimsby. And that's a presentation that we made to council back in December. And that involved undertaking a peer review of other systems the size of Grimsby that operate transit systems, trying to get an understanding of what type of service could be implemented here in Grimsby. Understanding the public's views on local transit. So we undertook a number of stakeholder interviews. We had an earlier public open house here in the fall of last year, and we undertook a telephone survey as well that you might submit. Some of you, maybe I can get a raised hand, anyone receive a call for their opinion on it? So it was a randomly sampled call that was made to get a representative sample of the town's opinion on public transit.
Can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
I didn't get a call, but can I ask you, what was the question that was asked, or questions asked on the phone?
There were a number of different questions that were asked on the phone. I don't have them all on me. We asked about 10. We asked people's support for public transit, whether they would take public transit, whether they were willing to pay for public transit, what type of public transit service they would like to use, where they travel. All sorts of questions, and I'll go through a bit of a summary of that as I go through my presentation. So with that in place, we've now since moved on to phase 2, which is to develop a service plan. And that's something that we've done. So we've gone through a lot of the comments and the feedback we've heard. We've identified a preferred service delivery or governance strategy in terms of how this will be governed, whether the municipality takes it on or whether they contract it out. We explore different funding opportunities. We've looked at potential partnerships and opportunities to coordinate with other service providers. And we're here today to gather some feedback on these preliminary recommendations. Yes. So that's why we're here today, is to gather some of that feedback. These recommendations certainly aren't set in stone. We're here to get that understanding of what your thoughts are. From there, we will make any revisions we have to our plan, and in mid-February, we present to council on our recommendation of the study, and it's their decision on whether to approve local transit or to say we don't need local transit at this point in time. So when we first start out with public transit, one of the first things we want to talk about is why public transit. Why is public transit important in our community? And this is a very important question to ask, particularly for those of you that drive, that don't have access, or have access to an automobile and may not see themselves taking public transit. And so when you look at transit, one of the important things that transit does is provide mobility to members of the community that don't have access to a private automobile, are unable to drive, or just simply choose not to drive. And you'll see this very important with students who may not have their license, and many youth now are delaying getting their driver's license now. One of the things I often see is, well, one of the things that driving prevents me from doing is texting. And so on a public transit vehicle, you have that opportunity. For seniors, as we age, we may lose our ability to drive, and it's important to have a mobility option within our community. And for adults who either can't afford a car or choose not to own a car, or people that want to reduce the number of cars in their household. You can go from a 3-car household to a 2-car household and save about $20,000 a year, which you can reinvest in your home, on vacations, whatever else you need. It supports future GO trains. So in 2021, GO train is coming to Grimsby. There's a need for parking at the GO train station. There's some congestion issues that might arise. So it provides that alternative delivery. And quite frankly, it is an expectation from Metrolinx that when they invest in GO train service in a community, that there is a local transit option that connects. It facilitates economic development, it can reduce unemployment, it can even attract certain industries to your community that are looking for labor that may not have access to an automobile. It can support sustainable development and intensification. So you have a lot of development occurring in the northwest component of Grimsby near the Winston area. The ability to support that development and provide alternative means of travel to reduce some of that car traffic is important. And contributes to higher quality of life, including improved health, affordability, reduced income, and community participation. So there's lots of benefits of transit that there's not always a cost associated with, but there is that ingrained cost that comes with it. As you mentioned, we did do that survey, and one of the questions we asked is, what's your support for introducing a local transit service within the community? About 84% of residents were in favor of introducing a local transit service. When we asked that same question, when it came down to increase in your overall municipal tax bill, if you don't mind, I'm going to save the questions until the end of the presentation, and then we'll have a forum and an opportunity to ask all of these. So is it something pressing, or can I wait? Okay. About 63% supported a property tax increase of about to $25 per household. Obviously, that went down as we increased that overall property tax increase from $50 to $100 per household. And again, this is just on average. When we asked what's the likelihood of using this type of service, about 58% said they would use a bus that would provide access to the GO station. About 54% said they would use a weekly fixed route bus, and about 39% identified that they would use a more dynamic transit or dynamic ride sharing or transit service that required an advanced reservation. What we heard from the public open house and a number of the focus groups is the importance of accessibility and having accessible bus stops, the focus on Main Street and Livingston being key for a number of destinations, the importance of considering intermunicipal connections, particularly with GO. There's a huge draw with that connection west into Hamilton, more so in the east into St. Catharines. The importance of service hours matching major employers, potential partnerships to implement shuttles, potential to service for service integration, as well as the importance of relatively frequent service. So this just identifies, when we did the public open house, where some of the key destinations and key origins that people had identified of where they want to go. And we use that partly to help define what the service would look like. So you see a significant concentration along the Main Street and Livingston corridor. You see a lot of people that would use transit. We also did that peer review of other cities, and again, this was really to identify other cities of Grimsby size that have transit services in place. What do they look like? What's the typical ridership they get? What's the number of hours of service that they provide? What's the typical frequency? The cost recovery that they get for the service. And in a community this size, and what we think is affordable, is what we typically see is a service that operates every 30 to 60 minutes during the peak periods, typically every 60 minutes during the middays and on Saturdays. Only a couple of them had service on Sunday. Typically what happens is if your weekday demand is 100, your Saturday demand may be 60, and your Sunday demand may be 30. And that's a typical industry average of what you can expect. And that's just based on people's travel patterns and how they move. In terms of service design, it's typically a hub and spoke system that allows for the ability to transfer between routes, with 2 to 4 different routes covering the entire municipality. The use of low-floor, medium-sized buses, or in some cases converted vans, depending on the type of ridership. And adult cash fares would range from $2 to $3, with concessions for seniors and students, and for multiple use of the system. And typically, you get about a 20 to 30% recovery from revenues on operating costs. And that's pretty standard for a municipality this size. There's no transit system in North America or even the world that makes money. You know, transit is viewed as an investment in your community, similar to a Parks and Recs facility is, similar to a roadway is. It's something that is used within the community to provide mobility for residents that need it. And one of the benefits of transit, it has an opportunity to collect some of that investment back from user fees, whereas other municipal services don't. So I sort of flip that around and say, well, that's the benefit of transit. You have that opportunity to collect on a public service where you may not for other public services that are provided. We looked at some of the primary destinations within Grimsby when we considered our service design again, and you see again the majority on the main Livingston corridor. And that led us to the design of the network. And the year one network is based on basically a two-route system. Route number one is what you see is the blue route. It starts at the Casablanca GO bus stop. And that would come south on Casablanca and east along the Main Street and Livingston corridor, providing access to a number of the key destinations, the high schools, the hospital, the downtown, a number of the seniors, residents. So it really is a really good corridor for transit in its ability to provide a direct two-way service. We recommended to stop at or near the YMCA as a potential destination, and then to continue that to the Beamsville GO bus stop. So one of the GO buses is now recently stopped at that station. So what that does is provide an extra ability to connect to a GO service or an intermunicipal service to provide connections to either St. Catharines or Niagara Falls or Welland, or west towards Hamilton or the rest of the GTA. The squiggly, sort of that dotted line you see going south through Beamsville is that potential extension to Beamsville. Lincoln is also interested in implementing a local transit service. They haven't done a study per se as we have here in Grimsby, but they have shown some interest. And what we're proposing here is a partnership with Lincoln where approximately 40 to 50% of those costs would be covered by Lincoln. So Lincoln would pay for its own share of the service. And what that does, in fact, is it provides a potential linkage opportunity between the two municipalities. And because of efficiencies in the scheduling, it actually reduces your overall cost in Grimsby. So for us, we view that as a win-win. So that's a potential solution if Lincoln decides to implement its own service and have a potential connection here in Grimsby. We also looked at route number 2, which is the red route that you see, and that travels west from the GO bus stop, crosses the QEW, and before that services some employment areas, and through that higher density area along Winston, goes through the Grimsby Beach area, and connects to the YMTA with a transfer opportunity on the east end of Grimsby to service the south part of Grimsby. So those are the two sort of initial routes that we had identified. We looked at Route 1 operating every 30 minutes during the peak periods, and every hour during the off-peaks, which is typical of a system this size. And Route 2, because of its lower density and lower population base, operating hourly throughout the day. Both routes would operate approximately starting at 6:30, ending at about 7:30 p.m., Monday through Friday. And on Saturdays, we proposed 8:30 to 6:30 because of the lower demand. On Sundays, we didn't introduce a service at this time. What typically happens is once you introduce a base service, you monitor ridership. If you reach certain thresholds and it becomes viable, then you look at extensions of the service, either introduction on Sunday, extension to the evening, or increases in frequency. When we looked at the 5-year network, this is not necessarily 5 years away, but this could be at any point where it becomes feasible to implement a new route. And what changes in year, let's say 3 to 5, and starting in 2021, mainly is the introduction of GO train service. And that's going to probably bring a few more riders that are connecting into Hamilton and the GTA, and the need for a stronger linkage. You'll also have continued growth along the Winston area, so we've identified a potential purple route servicing that area. And so the big change here is Route 1 stays the same, Route 2 gets short-turned at the Grimsby GO station, and we implement a third route along Winston area with a connection to Hamilton. Now there's some retail development occurring in Hamilton, some sort of big box retail. If Hamilton decides to extend its service from Fruitland Road to 50 Road, there's an opportunity to integrate the two services and provide that Hamilton connection. That would only take place if Hamilton decided to make that extension of its own route. If it didn't, then that would be a bus that would lead to nowhere, and we would just increase the frequency within Grimsby. So that's subject to agreement with Hamilton and their willingness to extend that service. And that's just sort of that blow up of that particular area. So within this, we would maintain that 30-minute frequency on Route 1. We would introduce that 30-minute peak frequency on Route 3, primarily due to the higher density development. And we would extend service hours to about 9:30 in the evening on weekends, weekdays, and 8:30 on Saturdays. And a lot of that has to do with attracting more of the intermunicipal travel from the GO train that comes in. And when people come in late, they want to make sure that you have a good bus connection to take you home. We also looked at how this would integrate with the overall intermunicipal connection. So you see, Niagara Region just did a study on intermunicipal routes. This is a preliminary study right now, so the recommendations haven't been formally approved by each of the councils, but they're looking at potentially a fair agreement with GO Transit to utilize the GO Bus Route 12 service into St. Catharines and Niagara Falls. So you would pay a Niagara Region Transit fare for that service instead of a GO fare for that service. So Niagara Region would subsidize the difference. So you can see our local route structure connects to that route structure at both the Casablanca station as well as the Beamsville GO stop on Ontario Street. And then there was also a recommendation to implement a Smithville route to connect to the Casablanca GO station, and that would come down and utilize part of Main Street going into the GO train, and then on the return trip travel along the South Service Road to provide some employment opportunities, and in the PM peak it would do the reverse direction. So it would provide a little bit more coverage into Grimsby using that integrated service. In terms of what we expect we can generate from this, overall in year 1, we expect we're going to get about 60,000 rides annually, growing to about 150,000 in year 5. Now the low ridership in year 1, we always recognize that when you introduce a transit service, it takes time for people to change their travel behaviors. They're not used to it. They may have 3 cars in the driveway, and I know I used to be a 2-car household, and I switched to transit when my car broke down. And I just decided not to replace it. It's very hard to walk by your car when it's sitting in the driveway. But if you can make those decisions about not purchasing a car for your child, because now there's a viable transit alternative that they can take, those type of decisions get made over time, as well as new residents coming into Grimsby now see that there's an alternative and they can make those decisions before they settle into the community. So that's why you see that over 5 years' time, we expect that ridership to continue to grow. We also identified an average fare anywhere between $90 to $225. So what you see here is the estimated operating costs. We based it on the municipality contracting it out based on an $80 an hour operating rate. So year 1, it would range between $650,000 to $700,000, of which you would recoup about 14% in revenue, and so the net cost would be about $560,000 to $610,000. In year 5, you would recoup more in revenue, but we're also adding some service. So the net cost increases slightly, even though your cost recovery increases. In terms of capital cost, we have a couple of different options that we're going to explore. This option at about $400,000 a bus is a 30-foot bus that will last about 12 years. We estimate we'll need about 4 to 5 in year 1 and about 5 to 6 in year 5, with potentially paying for 1.5 of those buses to further reduce those costs. There are other options that we're still exploring as well, smaller capacity vehicles, but they typically don't last as long. So we're looking into that, and we're going to present those options to council. But those are some of the costs, including the bus stop signs, shelters, and bus pads. There are some additional funding sources. Provincial gas tax is available for municipalities that operate transit systems. Our estimate right now, based on discussions we've had with the Ministry of Transportation, is Grimsby would be eligible for about $200,000 annually when they implement the service. And so that would further offset the costs that I've identified. Province recently made an announcement that they're doubling their investment in provincial gas tax, and that will be in place within about 5 years. So that can increase to over $400,000 in year 5 to further offset. There's the potential for federal public transit infrastructure funding for some capital investments. So that there may be some potential starting after 2018, depending on when the service is implemented. There's the potential for Niagara Region to support some of the operating costs for that connection into Lincoln. There are development charges that can be paid to offset some of the capital costs, the vehicle purchasing costs, and that's really a charge where growth pays for growth. So new residents that come in pay for their portion of the services that are provided towards growth. With the Lincoln partnership, we can offset some of those costs for Route 1, and there's also advertising and charter services. So depending on the type of vehicle that we purchase, there's an offset to use that vehicle to charter services for tourism and offset some of those costs, and some minor advertising contracts that can be used as well. So in summary, our belief is that transit will provide additional mobility options for persons in Grimsby, and that we believe that there is broad-based community support for local transit. There are some additional funding sources that should be available to offset some of these costs and potentially further reduce potential increases in municipal property tax that may result for a service of this type. It supports the arrival of GO train service in Grimsby and supports investment and the ability to support that high density development in Northwest Grimsby that is happening. What transit will do will help mitigate some of the traffic that will come out of there and create a more sustainable community. So in terms of our next steps, we're here today to gather your feedback and refine the plan. We'll then present this, the final recommendations to council. If approved, we'll look at further exploring funding opportunities and seeing how we can offset some of those costs, initiating discussions with potential municipal partners, soliciting proposals for contractors to operate the service, purchasing vehicles, initiating a pilot project and monitoring performance, adjusting routes and service as necessary. So thank you for your time. Now I'm going to turn it over to any questions that you may have. Now, just given the